you seen the business section in Jammy Magazine?
Yes, I love Jammy Magazine Business. They cover matters from all over the world that pertain to African people.
African multilateral financial institutions in the emerging New World Order. Let's see if we can see Professor Sachs. Can you hear us? Abuja calling.
Thank you very much. Warm greetings to everybody. I've been listening intently to the fantastic discussion of the last couple of days. It's very impressive, and it's very clear that the mood is very positive, and I share that sentiment completely. I believe that the next decades are Africa's turn for supercharged economic growth. You know, I often make the comparison because I think it's real. There are 3 places in the world today with 1.5 billion people: China, India, and Africa. China began its supercharged economic growth in 1980. And between 1980 and 2020, China averaged nearly 10% per year economic growth. China was a very poor country in 1980. By some measures, 70% or higher in extreme poverty. By 2020, extreme poverty was 0. And that's not just propaganda, that's the reality. I've been to the poorest counties of China. They're not poor anymore, believe me. When an economy grows at 10% per year, it doubles every 7 years. Since China did that for 40 years, that means that it had more than 5 doublings. And more than 5 doublings means more than a 32-time increase of the Chinese economy. Now, roughly 15 to 20 years later, India began its period of rapid development. It lagged behind China, in part because the reform process in India started later. The opening to the world economy, and here I want to stress that both China and India grew rapidly by exporting rapidly to the world. India began its rapid growth around the year 2000. It's been at it for 25 years. India is the fastest growing large economy in the world today, growing faster even than China, because as China's become richer, the growth has gradually declined. India is now growing reliably at 6 to 7% per year. When you grow at 7% per year, the doubling period is a decade. If you do that for 3 decades in a row, the economy doubles 3 times or is an 8-fold higher 30 years later. Now, in my view, the next period of rapid growth is Africa's turn. Not that India will suddenly slow down, or China. Both will continue to grow rapidly, as will other parts of Asia. But I think Africa can be and should be the premier growth of the world economy from now until the goal of 2063, the 100th anniversary of African unity. All of the vision of Africa as a high-income continent is completely achievable, in my view, between now and 2063. Indeed, I think that's the course that Africa will achieve. Now, what is the basis for that? We've already heard from several of the speakers, and I was enjoying listening to Mr. Dangote enormously just now, that the key is investment. The key is to raise the rates of investment on the continent from roughly 20 to 25% of the income to around 40% of the income. Rapid growth means a supercharged investment rate. And the key is investment in 3 complementary areas. And this is very important because two of the three areas have a big role for government. The third role has a big role for Mr. Dangote and his colleagues, the business sector. But the first area of investment that is the gold mine for Africa is investment in education. There is no higher return for Africa or for any country than investing in its children and getting them a quality education, at least through upper secondary completion, and now with a significant proportion going on for some kind of advanced training. Currently, Africa graduates roughly 30% of its young people in upper secondary. That should become 100% in the coming few years. In other words, keep the kids in school, bolster the education, create the skilled workforce, create the entrepreneurial capacities of all of these young people, and Africa will have it made. Believe me, this is the most important single investment, and it is core to China's success, which had an astounding rise of educational quality and completion, and a core part of India's success. So the first area of investment is in education. The second area of investment is in infrastructure. As Mr. Dangote just said, certainly electricity for everybody, certainly digital access for everybody, certainly transport facilities for everybody. And that is practical, affordable investment, but it means a lot of investment in the coming 2 decades. It means a lot of construction, which is going to be using Mr. Dangote's cement, because construction will be a boom sector across Africa as Africa is building its physical infrastructure, building its cities, which are continuing to expand at an enormous rate because Africa is urbanizing, of course, very rapidly as well. So power is crucial. The power sector, the digital connectivity, the road network, the rail connections, the ports, the airports, the urban infrastructure. This is a major part of the investment scene. The third area of investment, of course, is the business sector. It's the private economy. And that is where the private entrepreneurs have, of course, the overwhelming responsibility. But there's no doubt a tremendous burst of entrepreneurship across Africa. If the skilled work is there and if the physical infrastructure is in place, then Africa will achieve a boom in the private sector as well. Of course, the private sector needs to be supported by smart industrial policies. No doubt that is part of the make any region great strategy is industrial policy. China has boomed on the basis of Made in China 2025, a China policy to upgrade technologies to world leadership standards over the 10-year period from 2015 to 2025. And Africa needs a Made in Africa strategy 2035, looking ahead the next 10 years. By the way, I was so moved and impressed with the talk of the Deputy Chair of the African Union, Salma Malika Haddadi. It was perfect. Absolutely exactly on track. For all of this high rate of investment to occur, this needs to be a continental-wide effort, not 55 separate times, although every one of the 55 countries of Africa needs to take initiatives. But the African Union and the Africa Continental Free Trade Area should make this a unified effort. Infrastructure should cross national borders. Power grids should cross national borders. Highways and rail should cross national borders. This should be intrinsic. Your planning ministers should be meeting with their neighbors, something that doesn't happen very much. They meet more in Washington than with their own neighbors. And the truth is, Washington doesn't have a role in this. This is absolutely true. This is an Africa initiative, and this is where the partnerships to establish a true African continental free trade area are essential. Now, all of this requires financing at a massive scale. And financing means both domestic resource mobilization and mobilization of international capital. That's how it's been done everywhere. And there is a lot of international capital available. When international capital sees that Africa is the fast-growing region of the world, the capital will pour in, and at long term, and at low interest rates. And it will be institutions like Bank that are in the lead of providing this low-cost financing. The multilateral banks in Africa are essential to this task, and especially important in the coming decade. They are the pipeline for low-cost financing to finance trade, as Bank does, to finance infrastructure, to finance also the human capital development, because governments should take on financing for education too. If their current domestic government revenues are insufficient and will take time to raise, then international financing is essential, because the rate of return to education is 20% compound annual. So if one needs to finance that internationally because domestic revenues are insufficient, go for it. But make sure that it's long-term, low-cost finance. Now here, I just want to say a word about the global financial architecture, because in just 3 days, we're going to have the Financing for Development conference in Sevilla, Spain, which is the fourth global financing for development conference. The point is the following. The poorer regions of the world, the lower income countries, lower middle income, low income countries, have the highest growth potential in the whole world. The idea that their credit ratings are lower than the credit ratings of the slow-growing rich countries gets everything wrong. The idea that the IMF tells Africa, oh, no, don't borrow so much, your debt is too high, is actually completely wrong. The problem isn't the scale of debt. The problem is that it's short-term. The problem is that it's high cost. What is needed is long-term, low-cost financing through the multilateral banks and through direct private financing, whether it's through bond markets or equity finance, because investment requires a 20 or 30-year time horizon. It can't be financed on the basis of 1 or 2 year loans. It needs to be financed on the basis of long-term, reliable financing. This brings me to one more point that I want to add to this discussion, which is that one of the reasons why Africa finds it so hard to borrow is that it borrows in dollars, in U.S. dollars. And one of the reasons it borrows in U.S. dollars is that each of the national currencies in Africa is too small, or the monetary unions up until now have been controlled by France. This needs to change. Africa needs its own monetary sovereignty. Africa should move to a monetary union. Africa should be borrowing in its own currency. Africa should have a lender of last resort, which is not the IMF, because the IMF is not a lender of last resort. The IMF waits till you're nearly half dead, and then it lends you some money on punitive terms that prevent rapid growth. What we need is an African currency, African monetary institutions, African settlements, an African lender of last resort. And we need Africa, of course, to have relations with other regions of the world that will also ensure stable financial relations. The Federal Reserve has not been Africa's friend. The Federal Reserve doesn't give swap lines. The Federal Reserve does not protect Africa when U.S. interest rates soar. The Federal Reserve does not look after Africa like it might look after Mexico or Ukraine or some other place in the world. So Africa needs its friends all over the world. The old partners are not partners. I'm sorry to say it. Africa needs some new partners. And new partners are obviously on the scene. New partners include India, with Prime Minister Modi leading the way in the G20 to welcome Africa as the 21st member of the G21, a big development that I pushed hard for as well. Africa needs close relations with China because China is a booming economy that provides almost a roadmap for 40 years of very rapid growth, as well as partnership through the Belt and Road and other initiatives. Though I tell my Chinese friends, please make the loans long-term, not short-term. Africa needs strong relations with the Gulf countries. Why is it that the Gulf countries promised $1 trillion to invest in slow-growing United States when that money should be deployed next door across the Red Sea in Africa in fast-growing Africa? This is what needs to be mobilized. So in short, ladies and gentlemen, plan for, look for, expect, and work for a very high growth next 30 years in Africa. Do it continental-wide. Make sure that Afrexim Bank, African Development Bank, the other multilateral institutions are in the forefront. They are key for an Africa-wide strategy. Let and encourage strong leadership of the African Union Commission to build the Africa Continental Free Trade Area so that the interconnections, the infrastructure, the continental-wide investments in education are done and accomplished. And look for a financing strategy that is consistent with rapid growth, not with austerity. Africa needs more debt, not less debt, but not short-term debt. Long-term, patient, low-interest capital to make the massive investments that will bring Africa to high-income status by 2063. No question it can be done. It can be done even sooner than 2063. But this is the trajectory. It's why Afrexim Bank and other banks are so crucial, why they absolutely require, without question, preferred creditor status. They should have all of the status to be the bulwark for Africa's rapid growth period. And anyone that says different from that, whether it's the so-called Paris Club or the Bretton Woods institutions, is just playing their own game. They're not speaking for Africa's interests. So it's a bit of a diplomatic fight ahead, but it's absolutely clear that Africa needs large-scale financing for a major investment acceleration to achieve the kind of rapid growth that is now in sight.
Thank you for watching our video. Go on and look at this next video on our Jammy channel, and don't forget to like and share.